Say her name, and people flinch. Mary first, Bloody Mary, a name that drips with fire and martyrdom, a name spoken as warning, as accusation, as shorthand for cruelty. But history loves nicknames, because they save us from asking harder questions. Who was Mary Tudor, really? Was she a fanatic? A tyrant? A monster crowned? Or was she a woman shaped by fear, betrayal, and a lifetime of loss, who ruled as she had been taught in a world that offered her no mercy? Tonight, we don't repeat the myth. We examine the woman. Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we explore history's darker corners. Tonight's episode is not comfortable. It deals with power, faith, punishment, and legacy. This is the story of Mary Tudor, England's first crowned queen regnant, and the woman history remembers as Bloody Mary. On the 18th of February 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, a long-awaited child was born to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Mary Tudor entered the world not as a monster, but as a miracle. England exhaled in relief. Catherine of Aragon had suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, and the loss of a son weeks after he was born. But Catherine had produced a living child, a daughter. And while England preferred sons and heirs, this child was treasured, loved, educated. She was christened Mary first, and she was baptized into the Catholic faith at the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich. For the first years of her life, Mary knew security. She was raised in royal households, surrounded by tutors, musicians, and scholars. Catherine ensured her daughter received an education equal to that of any prince in Europe. She could speak Latin, French, Spanish, and Greek. She read theology. In music, she could play the lute and the virginals. Mary was intelligent, serious, deeply pious, and intensely loyal to her mother. Catherine instilled in her daughter the belief that queenship was her divine duty. As the daughter of two ruling monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Catherine did not hold the same prejudice against female rulers as her husband Henry. In this respect, she exerted a profound influence over her young daughter. At this point in Mary's life, there was nothing to suggest tragedy. But Mary's future rested on one dangerous truth. Her safety depended entirely on her father's favour, and that favour did not last. Henry VIII wanted a son, and it was becoming clear to him that Catherine could no longer give him one. In the early 1520s, Henry was seeking a way out of his marriage. He had met Anne Boleyn, and his desire to marry her was rather frantic. He wanted an heir, and someone as young as Anne could give him what he wanted. Unlike other women at court, Anne refused to be Henry's mistress. She wanted to be queen. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled, claiming that since Catherine had been the wife of his deceased brother Arthur, her union with Henry was in fact incestuous. The Pope refused. So Henry did something unprecedented. In 1534, Henry broke with Rome and established the Church of England. The England Reformation had begun, and this was not born of theology. It was born of obsession, and Mary stood directly in its path. Her parents' marriage started to break down in 1528, and by 1531, Catherine of Aragon was banished from court. Mary was barred from seeing her mother, and Anne Boleyn was established as queen in all but name. Her mother was cast aside, and Mary was prevented from seeing her mother, to whom she remained fearlessly loyal. During this time, Mary was often sick, not really surprising given the situation she was forced to live under. In January 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret, and his marriage to Catherine was declared null in the May. Mary was then declared illegitimate at the age of 17. Overnight, she went from Princess of Wales to bastard daughter. She was stripped of her title, removed from her mother, and after Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth, Mary was forced to become a lady-in-waiting to her baby half-sister. This was not merely humiliation, it was psychological warfare. Mary was ordered to renounce her mother as queen, accept the annulment, and to acknowledge her own illegitimacy. She refused, and for that refusal she was punished. Mary was separated from Catherine for the rest of her mother's life. They were not allowed to meet, they were not allowed to write, although they did, in secret, defying the king. Henry's advisers, they threatened Mary repeatedly. She was warned that refusal to comply could result in imprisonment. Or worse. Executions were common in her father's court. Mary had seen them. She lived under constant fear, physically isolated, emotionally broken, and convinced, not unreasonably, that she might be next. This period scarred her deeply. Mary learned in that time that power was absolute, that obedience was enforced, and that mercy, that was optional. And that survival, it required endurance. As everything else was stripped from Mary, Mary clung to the one thing she could not surrender, her faith. Catholicism was not a political stance for Mary. It was her mother's legacy, her moral compass, her anchor. When Henry demanded she reject the Pope, Mary saw it as a betrayal not just of Rome, but of truth itself. Her refusal was not passive, it was defiant. And defiance had consequences. On the 7th of January, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire. Mary was inconsolable. Her mother meant the world to her, and she was not allowed to attend her own mother's funeral. She was not allowed to mourn publicly. She was not allowed to speak her name. Shortly after Catherine's death, Anne Boleyn herself fell out of favour with the king and was executed. Another lesson in how swiftly favour could turn to annihilation. Mary survived by submitting outwardly while holding her beliefs inwardly. She learned how to wait. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary was 31 years old. His successor, Edward VI, was a Protestant child king ruled by advisers determined to erase Catholicism entirely. Under his rule, and guided by his advisers, Mass was outlawed. Priests were married. Churches were stripped. Catholics were punished. Mary was pressured again, more forcefully than ever, to abandon her faith. She refused. Once again, her life hung in the balance. She was saved not by mercy, but by politics. Executing Henry VIII's daughter was too dangerous, it was too public, and it was too destabilising. So Mary endured. She watched England change around her. She watched belief become crime, and she remembered every lesson. By the time Mary Tudor reached adulthood, she had learned that legitimacy could be erased by decree, that faith could make you a criminal, that survival, well, that required absolute conviction, and that mercy was not guaranteed, and that power, once lost, must never be surrendered again. She had been humiliated, isolated, threatened, and yet she endured. This was not the making of a gentle ruler. This was the forging of someone who believed that weakness invited destruction. The fire had not yet come, but the fear that would fuel it was already burning. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, England did not exhale. It tightened. The throne passed to his only legitimate son, Edward VI, a child of just 9 years old. And power did not rest with the boy king. It rested with the men who ruled his name, and those men were committed Protestants. Where Henry had wavered, Edward's government was absolute. Catholicism was no longer merely unfashionable. It was illegal. Mass was abolished. Altars were dismantled. Images were smashed. Latin was replaced with English prayer. For the first time in English history, faith itself became a crime, and Mary Tudor stood directly in its path. Mary was no longer simply Henry VIII's daughter. She had become a threat. Her very existence challenged the Protestant settlement. Edward's advisers pressured her relentlessly to conform. They demanded she abandon Catholic worship and attend Protestant services. They warned her, again and again, that refusal would bring consequences. But Mary refused. She continued to hear Mass privately, protected only by her rank and by her international politics. Spain watched closely. The Holy Roman Empire watched closely. To arrest or execute Mary would risk war. So instead, the government did what it did best. It isolated her. Mary lived under near constant surveillance. Her household was infiltrated, her servants questioned, her correspondence monitored. Priests who served her were hunted down. To be associated with Mary was dangerous, yet she still refused to bend. Faith was no longer just belief, it was identity. Mary's Catholicism was the last thing no one could take from her, and she understood something vital. If she surrendered now, she would never be allowed to rule. Under Edward VI, England transformed at breathtaking speed. Churches were stripped bare, stained glass windows destroyed, relics were burned, and monasteries were dissolved. For ordinary people, this was not enlightenment. It was loss. Faith had structured life. Ritual had marked birth, marriage, death. Now it was gone. Mary watched all of this happen. She watched England become a country she barely recognised. And she remembered. By her mid-30s, Mary had survived. She had learned to wait. But waiting is not passive. Mary observed how power was wielded, how laws were enforced, how dissent was crushed. She learned that belief could not coexist with compromise. She learned that authority required force. And perhaps most dangerously, she learned that faith justified suffering. Edward VI was sickly throughout his short life. By 1553, it was clear he was dying, and panic spread through the Protestant establishment, because Mary was still alive. Still Catholic, still legitimate. Edward was persuaded to go against his father's wishes and alter the succession. Guided by John Dudley, 1st Duke of Northumberland, Edward bypassed both Mary and her younger half-sister Elizabeth and named Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Lady Jane was Northumberland's daughter-in-law and the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary. She was also young, Protestant, and perhaps easily controlled. Mary was none of those things. When Edward eventually died in July of 1553, England stood at a crossroads. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen in London on the 10th of July 1553 by Northumberland and his supporters. But Mary, she did not flee, she did not hide, and she did not submit. Instead, she did something extraordinary. She claimed the crown. From East Anglia, Mary issued a declaration asserting her lawful right to rule. She rallied supporters, nobles, gentry, ordinary people who remembered the old faith, who resented the pace of change, and who feared instability. Support flooded in. The government hesitated. And in that hesitation, the balance tipped. Within 9 days, Lady Jane Grey was abandoned. The Privy Council switched allegiance. London erupted in celebration. Mary entered the capital not as a fugitive, but as a queen. The first woman to rule England in her own right. And it should have been the end of her suffering. Instead, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Mary did not ascend the throne as a blank slate. She brought with her decades of fear, a belief that her survival was miraculous, absolute certainty in her faith, and a deep conviction that disorder must be crushed. She believed sincerely that God had preserved her for a reason, and that reason was the restoration of the Catholic faith. England, she believed, had been led astray, and she intended to lead it back, no matter the cost. When Mary I was proclaimed Queen in July 1553, England entered uncharted territory. There had been queens before, consorts, regents, and mothers ruling in a son's name, but never a woman crowned in her own right. Mary understood the danger immediately. A queen had to rule harder than a king. Mercy would be mistaken for weakness. Indecision would invite rebellion. Her reign began with celebrations. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, bonfires lit the streets. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Mary had waited her entire life for power, and she had learned exactly how fragile it was. Mary's first major decision was also her most telling. Lady Jane Grey, the young Protestant queen who had briefly replaced her, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Initially, Mary showed mercy towards Jane Grey. Mary understood that Jane and her husband Guildford had merely been pawns in others who had plotted against Mary. Jane and her husband were both imprisoned in the Tower of London. But mercy has consequences. And in early 1554, Jane's father joined the Wyatt's rebellion, a Protestant uprising using Jane Grey as their figurehead. This forced Mary's hand. It was too risky to keep Jane alive, and so she and her husband were executed on the 12th of February, 1554. Mary announced her intention to marry Philip II of Spain, heir to the Spanish throne and one of the most powerful Catholic monarchs in Europe. She had been much encouraged by her cousin Charles V of Spain. To Mary, the marriage made sense. It secured Catholic alliances, strengthened her claim, offered the possibility of an heir, and in her mind's eye she was convinced that forming closer relations to Spain would keep England safe. But to England, it was terrifying. People feared Spanish domination, Catholic absolutism, and the loss of English independence. Anti-Spanish ballads and broadsheets were circulating the London streets. Rumours spread. Protestant leaders panicked. But it wasn't just the English who feared the alliance. The French did too. Wyatt's rebellion was not just about religion. It was about sovereignty. Mary responded decisively. Wyatt's forces marched on London. Mary addressed the city herself, a rare and powerful moment. She spoke not as a queen pleading for loyalty, but as a monarch demanding it. And London stood by her. The rebellion collapsed. This time, mercy ended. Mary had learned the lesson her father taught well. A living symbol is more dangerous than a dead one. With rebellion crushed and marriage secured, Mary turned to her true mission, the restoration of Catholicism. Parliament repealed Protestant reforms. England formally reconciled with Rome. Latin Mass returned, and church rituals were reinstated. For Mary, this was not tyranny, it was correction. But restoring faith required eliminating heresy, and heresy in Tudor England was punishable by death. 1555, the burnings began. Men and women accused of Protestant heresy were tried under revived laws and sentenced to death by fire. They were burned publicly, not secretly, not quietly. Public executions were meant to instruct, to terrify, to warn. Mary believed, sincerely, that she was saving souls. Heresy to her was spiritual poison. Unchecked, it condemned not just individuals, but the entire kingdom. Fire purified. At least that was the theology. Around 283 people were burned during Mary's reign. This was brutal, but it was not unprecedented. Her father had executed far more, Catholics and Protestants alike. Her successor would execute Catholics in turn. Yet history remembers Mary alone. Why? Because she was a woman, and because her enemies controlled the narrative. The burnings did not produce the obedience Mary expected. Mary believed that these punishments would save souls from eternal damnation. She saw Protestant dissent as a political threat, since it challenged the legitimacy of the Catholic Church and her government. Instead, it hardened resistance. Crowds watched martyrs die. Sympathy grew. Stories spread. The fire did not silence dissent. It amplified it. And the Marian persecutions, as they became known, were brutal. She had the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, burned at the stake. She had the bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley burned at the stake together in Oxford. It is reported that Latimer encouraged Ridley by saying, "We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Other victims included ordinary men and women who refused to attend Catholic Mass or who owned Protestant literature. Many came from towns such as Colchester, Lewes, and Canterbury, where strong Protestant communities had developed. Mary could not let this continue. In her eyes, this showed utter contempt for her and the Catholic faith. To stop now would mean admitting she was wrong, and Mary had survived her entire life by refusing to admit that. Mary believed she was ruling as God demanded. She believed compromise was betrayal. She believed her suffering had meaning, that it had prepared her to endure what others could not. But conviction without flexibility becomes cruelty, and fear, when armed with power, becomes violence. Mary Tudor did not invent religious persecution. She inherited it. And she wielded it exactly as she had been taught. By the mid-1550s, the fire that Mary believed would purify England was already beginning to consume her. The executions had failed to destroy Protestant ideas and had instead created martyrs, and their stories began to be circulated. Her marriage to Philip of Spain had not delivered the one thing her reign depended on, an heir. Mary believed twice that she was pregnant. The court believed it, England believed it. Bonfires were lit, cradles prepared. But no child came. Historians now believe Mary suffered phantom pregnancies, possibly caused by hormonal imbalances, stress, or underlying illness. Conditions poorly understood in the 16th century, but devastatingly real to women experiencing them. Each false hope crushed her further. A queen without an heir was a queen whose work could be undone, and Mary knew exactly who would undo it. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, remained alive. She was Protestant, she was popular, and Elizabeth was patient. Elizabeth had learned different lessons from the same childhood chaos. Where Mary clung to certainty, Elizabeth mastered ambiguity. Where Mary demanded obedience, Elizabeth cultivated loyalty. And where Mary ruled through belief, Elizabeth ruled through performance. Mary feared Elizabeth, not because Elizabeth openly rebelled, but because she did not, and because England was already imagining her on the throne. By 1557, Mary's health had deteriorated rapidly. She was suffering from chronic pain, weakness, swelling, and fever. Modern historians suspect ovarian cancer or uterine disease, possibly compounded by influenza during a deadly epidemic. She was exhausted. Her reign had been short, her efforts relentless, her resistance immense. And the burnings, the very acts meant to secure her vision, were increasingly unpopular. The fire did not restore unity. It hardened division. Mary Tudor died on the 17th of November 1558 at St James's Palace, aged just 42. She died believing she had failed. Her restoration of Catholicism was already unravelling. Her husband had largely abandoned England, and her people were divided. Her successor was inevitable. Within weeks, Elizabeth ascended the throne, and with her coronation, Mary's work was undone. The Mass was abolished again, Rome was rejected again, and Catholics were marginalised again. History did not pause to mourn Mary Tudor. It rushed to condemn her. And even in death, she was prevented from being buried from where she wanted to be. In her will, Mary had wished to be buried next to her mother, but instead she was interred on the 14th of December in a tomb in Westminster Abbey. Later, she would be joined by Elizabeth in that tomb, to which an inscription would be fixed, saying, Regno consortes et urne, hic obdomimus Elizabetha et Maria sorores in spe resurrectionis, which translates, Consorts in realm and tomb, we sisters Elizabeth and Mary here lie down to sleep in hope of the resurrection. The nickname Bloody Mary did not fully crystallise during Mary's lifetime. It was forged after her death. Under Elizabeth's reign, Protestant writers set about reshaping England's recent past, and Mary, well, she became the perfect villain. She was Catholic, foreign-aligned, female, childless, and associated with fire. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs immortalised Protestant suffering under Mary's reign, depicting her as uniquely cruel and uniquely sadistic. Her father's executions were softened. Elizabeth's future executions would be justified. But Mary's violence was portrayed as madness. Because history is not written by the fair, it is written by the victorious. Was Mary uniquely cruel? This is the question that matters. The answer is uncomfortable. Mary burned around 283 people for heresy. But her father, Henry VIII, he executed thousands by hanging, beheading, and burning. And his victims included Catholics, Protestants, nobles, wives. Elizabeth, she would later execute Catholics for treason and religious dissent. Religious violence was not an aberration. It was policy. Mary's difference was not brutality. It was conviction and gender. A man who rules harshly is decisive. A woman who does the same is monstrous. Mary Tudor ruled exactly as a Tudor monarch was expected to rule. She simply lacked the luxury of survival. Mary's reign cannot be understood without her childhood. She was declared illegitimate. She was separated from her mother. She was threatened with death. She was forced to deny her identity, and she was persecuted for her faith. She learned early that compromise meant annihilation. When she finally gained power, she ruled as someone who believed weakness would destroy her. Mary did not rule from cruelty. She ruled from fear. Fear hardened into conviction. Conviction hardened into violence. This does not excuse her actions, but perhaps it goes a little way towards explaining them. Mary Tudor has become folklore, a cautionary tale, a horror story, a nickname. But when we strip away propaganda, we are left with something far more unsettling. A woman who believed she was right. A woman who believed suffering had meaning. A woman who believed God demanded obedience because that was what her world had taught her from childhood. Mary did not invent religious persecution. She inherited it, and she carried it to its logical conclusion. What do we do with Bloody Mary? Mary I is not easy to remember. She does not fit into the heroic narratives. But history is not about comfort. It is about truth. Mary Tudor forces us to confront uncomfortable realities. How trauma can shape power. How belief justifies violence. How gender alters legacy. And how history punishes failure more than cruelty. She was not a cartoon villain. She was a queen forged in fear. And her story is a warning. Mary Tudor did not believe that she was evil. She believed she was carrying out God's work. She was a queen forged by fear. She believed she was saving souls. She believed England's suffering had purpose. She believed her own suffering had prepared her to rule. And that belief destroyed her. History, it doesn't create monsters, it creates mirrors. And when we look at Mary I, we are not seeing a demon crowned. We are seeing what happens when power meets fear. And faith, it allows no doubt. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of The Eclectic. And if you have, could you possibly text a friend after this episode and tell them about this podcast? You'll be doing me a great honor. Once again, stay curious, stay compassionate, and as always, stay eclectic.